Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and welcome to the Political Postbox weekly show where I just look at a very small number of comments that appeared on various videos from the past week and just add my own thoughts to them. Don't get excited as well. As you can obviously see, I'm sat back down on my chair again here. That's nothing to do with the setup downstairs. It's just purely for the format of this. It's a lot easier still to do it this way. So, but there will be more tomorrow. I will talk more tomorrow about the new setup. Hopefully you are starting to see some improvements anyway, but we'll see. So yeah. So first one, let's go on to it. So this is about the United States of Europe thing again. It says, how does the UK benefit from being inside the EU? If the main goal of the EU is the United States of Europe, is that good or bad, and why? And again, I mean, obviously I've just done a video on this today, so I don't want to labour the point too much. But it all depends on what you mean by that. Obviously, we want Europe to be united. The goal of the EU is harmonisation. It's not forming a super state. It's not forming one country. Wouldn't even work as well. On the very simplest level, we don't even speak the same bloody language for a start. No, it's ultimately about harmonisation, so that ultimately it was a peace project. That's what it was, and it's achieved that quite successfully. In terms of, because if different states within the EU tried to go to war with each other, they knacker their own economies. That was the whole premise of it. You know, the economies would be so intertwined that war between any two states would completely screw them. As we're about to prove by trying to leave the EU, we're going to screw our economy over. It just shows how effective those binds were, which was somehow made out to be a bad thing by the Brexiteers. So greater harmonisation is, of course, really good. But again, like I say, you know, when you're talking, it's not like laws get foisted onto people, certainly not the most powerful nations in the EU. Because no, you know, although in theory, on the EU Council at any rate, it's one member state, one vote. Not really the same thing in the UK, in the EU Parliament, because you get the number of seats according to the size of your country. But in reality, the way diplomacy works is a small member is not really going to go against the larger ones. They might try and get something out of it. You know, it might be a bit like, you know, the larger nations want a thing to happen. The smaller ones are okay with it. And let's say one of the smaller ones is a bit cunning and they go, yeah, I'd like to support it. I really would, but I've got this little problem going on at home, and, you know, that's going to take up my attention there, really. And then they go, well, what's the problem? And they say, well, it's this. And you go, oh, well, we can help you with that in return for your support on this. And that's how diplomacy works. So, but the proof of the pudding ultimately is in what the EU's done. The EU is now incredibly powerful. The best way I can explain it really is by looking at very, very powerful US companies like Facebook, like Amazon, like Google. And ordinarily, the only people that can even come close to keeping them in line is the US government. Of course, they're American companies. The US government has not only, you know, the moral right to keep them to task, but also the might itself, the political and economic might. Whereas in you know, individual European nations, not so much, like we have shown as the UK, which is supposedly quite a powerful country. When we wanted the CEO of Facebook, Zuckerberg, to attend a select committee hearing, he refused. He wouldn't turn up. We just looked stupid. When the EU wanted him to turn up and face a few questions, he turned up there. And that's ultimately what it is. And you've got, you know, they're able to enact laws that worry these large multinational corporations. The EU can hold to account multinational corporations in a way that individual member states can't, because they cover such a large proportion of the globe. They have such a large there's such a large market that these companies have to take them seriously. They have to. And also another benefit is, I mean, you could argue that the UK Parliament, or the UK government certainly, we could have had Zuckerberg turn up. All we'd have to do is say something like, oh, really, you don't want to engage with us? Well, in that case, we're going to block Facebook in the UK. he would soon come scuttling through then. So what we have is another issue with on an individual member state, corruption in government, or at the very least a government not necessarily having the best interests of its people at heart, because, you know, there might be financial inducements for them. You don't really get that in the EU to the same extent, because it's much more accountable. There are far more people involved that will call someone else out if they're being... you can't really buy them off in the same way as you can governments, because on an individual member state thing, you only really have to buy a few people off, or even just donate to a particular party. Doesn't really work in the EU Commission. Doesn't have the same impact there. It's not as easy to corrupt them. So, yeah. But, I mean, in terms of what we'd mean, like, because as I was saying in the video today, Winston Churchill used the term United States of Europe as simply that, not trying to liken it to a United States of America as such, but, you know, that the states of Europe are united, which they are. And, you know, and long may that continue. On to the next one, slightly related. And again, this is directly from the video I did today. So someone's saying here, we already have a federal system in Europe. We are the US of E in all but name. America is 50 countries who just pretend to be one country. No, it's not, it's a confederacy. But it says, I don't see the difference. Okay, I'll show you a couple of differences. So Donald Trump works to do a few things that has not met with widespread approval in America. Let's take, for example, banning people from various Muslim countries. Now, initially when he tried to do that, he did it in the wrong way, and judges were able to say, no, you can't do it like that. Now, they weren't saying he couldn't do it. They were just saying he can't do it in that way. All right. So then he did it in the way that he can do it, and now he's gotten away with it. All right. There's lots of states in America that are opposed to it. What can they do about it? Nothing. What could a member state do? If the EU tried to do this, if they tried to say, we're not letting anyone into the EU from certain countries, I mean, the UK would never block that because, you know, we're the most xenophobic in the EU. But let's say this became a general thing, and even a single EU member state said, no, that's not right. What would they do about it? They'd block it. They would just say, no, you're not doing that. And that'd be all there is to it. Simple as that. Because a matter like that would require a unanimous vote in the EU Council. Take Donald Trump's wall. Lots of states in America don't want this wall being built. What would that happen in the EU if the EU Commission decided it wanted to build a wall? A single member state would just say no. And that would be the end of it. You know, he also, you know, there's the migrant camps there where he's separating families, all those sort of things. Now, these, I mean, for a start, these sort of things wouldn't even be possible in the EU. I mean, that's a difference in itself because of the European Convention on Human Rights. But let's say they wanted to do anything like this. A single member state would just say no. That is the difference between the EU and the United States of America. The president has executive powers that are not to be found in Europe or anywhere in the EU. Whether you talk about the EU organisation, I don't believe they're even really to be found in many EU nations. They're certainly not to be found in the UK, but they're not to be found in the EU either. There is no one with that sort of executive power at all. You know, a single country, one of the 28 members of the EU, at the moment it's still 28 anyway, can just say, no, that's not acceptable. And that'll be all there is to it. And in reality, you usually find in these scenarios that there's several member states that agree with each other that it's not acceptable. So that's quite easy, that one. What is the difference? That. No state in America can override Donald Trump's executive powers or, you know, some federal decisions like that. Next one says, can you please talk about Gibraltar? Oh, forgot about them. Please do this. I mean, I don't know really what to say other than all I can, you know, for me, the significance of Gibraltar is going to be if we leave the EU, and everyone is talking about the fact, leave the EU, everything's a complete disaster, as it has to be, because for it not to, right, we cannot exist on WTO terms exclusively for any length of time. Everyone knows that. We're going to see the effects immediately. So then what has to happen? Boris Johnson has to go out, if he's still Prime Minister, he has to go out and get trade agreements. How's he going to do that while still sticking to his guns? It's not possible. So he's going to have the climb down of his life in order to get this. And it will still take time because, do you know what? The EU in that position will be in a strong position. The EU at the moment are being nice to us because we're part of the EU. Make no mistake, no one is denying the fact that the EU is protectionist. Yes, it is forming the largest free trade bloc in the world. It has done, and it's still getting bigger. But ultimately, it protects its members. That's what it does. And once we've left, we're no longer a member, and we will be seeking to get an agreement with the EU. And straight away, in that scenario, we have turned down the withdrawal agreement. The withdrawal agreement's burned in the bin. So at this point, we can't just go to the EU and say about that withdrawal agreement we had, can we have it now? Because most of the rest of them may be fine with it, but Spain will go, no, right, yeah. What about Gibraltar then? How do you feel about Gibraltar? That will be the narrative they want to push. Now, it is possible if we do this quickly enough, the rest of the EU will tell Spain to sit down and shut up. But if we let it go on for a little bit and we cause sufficient damage, or more so that the EU starts to find its markets, they sort themselves out, they start to recover from the fact that they're no longer able to do business as easily with the UK. No one's saying that business stops completely. But in a situation like that, where the EU become much less desperate, Spain can become more desperate. So if we do leave, Gibraltar is probably going to be a bargaining chip at some point. And a lot of people are talking about, the breakup of the United Kingdom as a result of Brexit. Well, Gibraltar's sovereignty is going to change too, or not as certain as some things, but quite likely. Certainly Spain will, they wanted to make it a bit of a condition during the Brexit process, but as I say, other nations told to shut up. At some point, they're not going to. Because remember, Spain is part of the EU, UK, if we've left, is not. Who are they going to support? They're going to support Spain in that scenario. As I say, the only. So if we don't sort something out quickly, Gibraltar becomes a bargaining chip. And if we decide we want to come back into the EU, Gibraltar definitely becomes a bargaining chip there. Because Spain, it's one thing for the rest of the member states to tell Spain to shut up so that we can have some sort of agreement and get trade back onto an even keel again. It's another thing to rejoin. The EU won't be as desperate for that. I'm sure they'd still prefer it if we did, but they're not going to be as desperate for it. In which case, they're less likely to tell Spain to shut up. And Spain will say, yeah, we're going to keep withholding our support. And it has to be unanimous. For a new member state to join, it has to be a unanimous decision amongst the EU Council. Spain will withdraw its support until, Gibraltar is no longer a British territory. And remember, Gibraltar is not part of the EU. So they already get to be shitty to them anyway, as it happens. They keep closing the border, or at least restricting it, just to be arseholes, not because they need to. They cite security, as everyone does in this scenario. So that's all I can really think of for that. If Boris Johnson gets his way, Gibraltar is buggered. Next one says Corbin has to be given the boot. His incompetence and enabling of the far-right madness of Brexit is unforgivable. I don't describe it as unforgivable. At the end of the day, more joy in heaven for over one sinner that repenteth and all that lot. If he sorted himself out, I'd be more than happy with him. Yes, he's caused a lot of damage so far. But I think you have got it right there. It is both incompetence and enabling of the far right. And I think they're two distinct things. I think he is incompetent. I think he's not capable of pushing his own agenda very well at all, which is why we've done very badly electorally. But he's also enabling the far right Brexit because he sees advantage in it himself. And he has enabled the Conservatives because he thinks there's political advantage. It's a bit like the political equivalent of giving them enough rope and they'll hang themselves. Lots of people on both sides of the House think that Brexit is going to make the Conservatives unelectable. We had a government minister saying this. Not a cabinet minister, of course, they're not allowed to say this. But I mean, technically, junior ministers are not supposed to say things like this either. But we had a junior minister say that a no-deal Brexit will be a disaster, and it could well mean the Conservatives are unelectable for 20 years. And there's been a few other Conservatives say that as well who are not in the government. And that is a belief, and it's a belief that Corbyn has. Now, whether it's true or not is different, because under normal circumstances, you say, of course it's true. But, you know, it's not like the public are really getting behind Labour at the moment either. But in terms of him being given the boot, he can't. He can't. And it's not even, I need to look up the Labour rules again, but it makes no difference. I seem to know what happened was basically he became leader because it was all, I don't need to go into the details of it. It was a mistake. But he was leader, and he was completely useless right from the get-go. And so the MP said, right, we've had enough of this, getting rid of him. Issued a vote of no confidence in his leadership, which he lost heavily. So it went, now, what's supposed to happen in this scenario is they are no longer the leader, or until they have to be leader till a new one person is appointed, or they appoint an interim, but they're not in it anymore. You now have a contest to see who's going to become the new leader. That is not what happened. The way the leadership contest is supposed to work is, just like the Conservative one now really, is MPs vote for a number of people until they whittle it down to 2 people that go on a ballot paper for the wider membership. But Corbyn circumvented that. He said, well, as I'm the leader, I'm going to be automatically on that ballot paper. Now, that was not my understanding, and it was not the understanding of a lot of people in the Labour Party either. But I can't attest to it at the moment because I can't remember what the rules said now, and I'd have to look them up. But it went to the NEC, the National Executive Committee, but they're packed out with his stooges, so they obviously found in favour of Corbyn. So not only was he allowed in the contest, which sounds a bit odd, but he didn't even have to garner any votes. He was going to be automatically on the ballot paper for reasons. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that that was a true reading of the party rules, or I didn't at the time, but I can't attest to it now. But the bottom line is this: the Parliamentary Labour Party can do nothing. They can issue another vote of no confidence and he will lose it badly. They wouldn't do this at the moment. It'd be stupid to do it at the moment when there's a general election coming. You don't fight your own leader when there's a general election coming. But they could. And you know, it'd be one of these things. Maybe if there's a general election and Labour does badly out of it, maybe they would. Maybe he'll actually do the decent thing and step aside this time. But the bottom line is, if he doesn't step aside, it would go to another election. They will, you know, he'll put himself back on the ballot paper, and the membership will just return him because they don't see him as incompetent or enabling the far right. They just think it's a far right ploy, and that all the criticism of him is from Tories. And if you're a Labour member like me and you criticise him, or you're really a Tory, you just infiltrated the party, when the truth of the matter is that it's a great many other people who infiltrated the party to keep him in government, I wish he was in government. Actually, I'd have far less to complain about then, because most of my criticism is not so much on his policy. It's like, if you compare Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn, I've always been accused of being a Blairite. I don't know what that's about. And look at their policies. I have far more in common with Jeremy Corbyn's policies. There's a few that I'm not happy about, but by and large, yeah, I'm going with that. Much more so than Tony Blair's. But the bottom line is, I don't judge a political leader based on their policies. Their policies are their wishes. I'm not into wishes. I'm not a child, and it's not my birthday, right? What I'm into is, what are you going to do? Because what you're going to do is a combination of your intentions and your competence and your resolve. He has intentions that I approve of, by and large. He doesn't have the competence to carry them out, and he doesn't have the resolve to stay the course. We know that. We can see that. In fact, that is actually one of the reasons why that large section of the membership now supports Corbyn. Not just because of his policies, but because he does what he's told. He's a bit of a puppet, really, which is another little worry for me. But there you go. So that's the issue with Corbyn. We are stuck with him until he just, you know, grows a conscience and steps aside himself. Next one, it says, it makes me angry how the working class is so easily led and manipulated. Is this why they always remain relatively poor and downtrodden? Yes, because we can have a vote, and the working classes have huge amount of the vote. Massive. Huge part of a society is ultimately a pyramid scheme. You know, the further down the bottom are, more of you are in a democratic society. That's bloody brilliant, isn't it? But not if you keep voting for the people who don't have your best interests at heart. That is ultimately it. You're falling for the lies. And again, it's this problem of supporting someone because of their policies. So the Conservatives say, yeah, we're going to support the NHS, we're going to do this, we're going to spend money, we're going to pump money into this and this and this and this and this, and we're going to reduce your taxes as well. Well, it sounds too good to be true. Do you know what? Because it is too good to be true, but they vote for it anyway because it's what they want to hear. So, you know, and that is why they're relatively poor and downtrodden. There's no trickle-down effect because they just keep voting for these people over and over again. Says, I was listening to a Brexiteer on the radio this morning lecturing people on how the Remain elites are anti-democratic, which was stomach-churning when one considers the far-right leanings of the current Tory government. Classic fascist behaviour, find a foe to blame and lead the masses to their own destruction. It is, but I'll tell you what annoys me about this so-called Remain elites thing. If you look at like the Brexit Party, all millionaires, all of them. You know, the senior members of the Tory Party, all millionaires. The Leave side is ultimately run and supported by millionaires, all of them, every single one. Remain side has millionaires too, because some wealthy people have a conscience, okay? But you've also got ordinary people on that side as well. You don't have that on the Leave side. You know, you won't find any Brexit Party candidates that are just ordinary people. Doesn't happen. Never happens. Not a single one is just an ordinary person. There are ordinary people who support them, don't get me wrong. Obviously, they're getting votes. Ordinary people are going along ticking their boxes. But the Brexit Party don't let those ordinary people represent them. How's that for being an elite? You know, how's that for anti-democratic elitism? You know, there are ordinary people who would like to represent them, who would like to become their candidates. No, because these people really are the elites. They look down on the common people. We can't possibly have them representing us. They're not us. They just say different things publicly because they want them to support them. They want them to vote for them, but they won't actually associate with them. Simple as that. Anyway, last one. Says the video title, Who Suffers First from Brexit? You can guess which video this is from. Seems not to acknowledge the harm which has already been done. Well, it wouldn't, because it wasn't on that. But I have done obviously plenty of videos on the harm already done and continue to do so because it is quite devastating. I'll come on to that in a minute as well. It says, this has already gone on for years and it has already had a huge effect. Millions of people who come from outside of the UK and British citizens who live elsewhere in the EU, between them already lost billions due to Brexit. Some have lost their homes, their jobs and or their nationalities of birth. I mean, that's not happened. Some people have changed it. That's not the same as losing it. These things have already happened, and while they have happened, British people have continued to talk about Brexit as if it only affects themselves. Want to know how the UK intends to compensate those of us who have already damaged for our losses. Not at all, because ultimately it's business. You know, if a business goes under, then there's no compensation awarded for, you know, if you, let's say you join a company, you get a job at a company and you move there and you spend your money moving from one part of the country to another. And then a year later, that company goes bust. It doesn't really owe you anything. And there might be a little bit of redundancy, but if you've only been there for a year, probably not much. In fact, I don't think statutory redundancy, there'll have to be anything for a couple of years. So yeah, none. That's all there is to it. You'll just have to live with the knowledge that the people who will ultimately suffer the most will be the people who voted for this catastrophe. But that's unfortunately the nature of international trade. You know, if one country decides it's going to do things differently, then it's going to do things differently. That's just a hazard of doing business, unfortunately. But just to, you know, I'll just go through a few things. So I have a website here. I'll put it in the description below. You can have a little look at it. It talks about Brexit, job loss and stuff like that. So by the reckoning of this, which was updated a couple of days ago, The total jobs lost due to Brexit is nearly 250,000. Total annual wages lost, about 7 billion. Reduction in annual income tax and national insurance receipts, about 2 billion. And then it has job losses by region. The 10 worst hit cities and towns. London being the worst hit, of course. Lots of businesses, financial sector in particular, have been leaving for the EU to get offices in the EU. One obviously that caught my eye in third place is Scunthorpe, which is the town where I live, and 5,400 jobs lost. Bridgend, of course, in there, and Swindon, the big UK car manufacturing towns. Grimsby, the town I was talking about that I used to live in, that's going to be very, very badly hit there. And then the worst hit sectors, it goes through obviously automotive, that'll come as no surprise, then transport, food and drink, finance, construction, clothing, aerospace, aerospace companies near here that have been reining back on the apprenticeships they've been offering because they're obviously not necessarily expecting to be staying here if things go sour. Agriculture, of course, ICT and hospitality. There's quite a lot of very useful information on here. It's worth a little look. But yeah, I'll put a description in the link below. But of course, a great deal of damage has been done. And some of the damage that has been done has not been felt yet. Because when you've got car manufacturing plants that have given 2 years notice, well, they still haven't closed down yet. The workers are still there. They're still getting paid. They're still doing work. They're still building cars. In a year and a half's time or 2 years, depending on when they got their notice, it is going to stop. And it makes no difference. If we stop Brexit this year, I don't think we're going to. I think we'll hopefully stop the no deal, but I think it will be next year before we actually stopped Brexit, if we're going to stop Brexit at all. It'll be too late. These are things that are now set in stone. We're not going to reverse them because when you've had businesses already invest elsewhere in the EU or move offices, they're not going to come back. They're not going to stop the investment and bring it back into the UK. The best we can hope is that we can start to rebuild. I mean, what it's basically like is it's like someone, the Brexit process, it's like a person losing their job, not being able to get another, dipping into their savings, and then, a few years later they get another job. Their savings don't come back. They're gone. What you can do is try and build them up again, with your new job. That's the situation we're going to be in. We're going to be in a rebuilding situation. So we're going to be economically buggered either way. And this is, and you know what's coming next. I'm always going to say this in this scenario. What's coming next ultimately is if we stop Brexit, the no deal Brexit supporters, when the economy is knackered and when more jobs have been lost, which they will say, but this wouldn't have happened if we'd have left. And you will not shut those people up. We just have to wait for them to die. Because that's ultimately it. The longer we go on, the more young people become voting age, the more old people lose their ability to vote in rather unpleasant ways. And the balance changes, and it doesn't matter what lies they try to feed us. That fear that they're trying to instill in the population just simply doesn't work on people who've grown up in the EU and know there's nothing to fear from it, because we're not got rose-tinted glasses thinking back to the 1960s, oh, it was all fine then. No, it bloody wasn't. That's why we joined in the first place, because it was very far from fine. But there you are. So those are my thoughts on this week's topics. Tune in for next week when there'll be a few more, but obviously every video in between as well, to put the comments on that I might respond to next week. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe for further content. And until next time, when I will be back on my new setup, but hopefully with a few more improvements, I'll see you later.